For 3 months, Jalen Carter gave his breakfast to a homeless woman everyone else ignored. A granola bar, an orange, black coffee in a thermos he'd gotten from Goodwill. 6:45 a.m. every single morning. Same bus shelter. Same cracked sidewalk. He was 18, black, working a warehouse job that destroyed his back just to pay for community college classes he took at night. She was in her 60s, white, wore an old military jacket, told stories about wars and missions that sounded like movies, not memories. Then one Tuesday morning, Jalen's entire world flipped upside down. 4 Army officers appeared at his warehouse job. Dress uniforms, medals catching the fluorescent lights. A colonel standing at attention beside the forklift where Jalen was stacking pallets. When his supervisor called him over, Jalen's stomach dropped. What did I do? If this story stays with you, share it. Some acts of kindness echo louder than we ever imagined. The colonel's voice was formal, measured. Jalen Carter? Yes, sir. Jalen's hands were still dusty from cardboard boxes. We're here about Margaret Dawson, the woman from a bus shelter. Jalen's chest tightened. Miss Margaret? Did something happen to her? The officer's expression didn't change. We need to speak with you privately. 3 months earlier, Jalen hadn't noticed her at all. He took the Route 9 bus every morning at 7 a.m. sharp. The shelter was 2 blocks from his apartment. One of those Section 8 places where the heat only worked half the winter and the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbor's alarm clock like it was in your own room. The bus shelter sat outside an abandoned check-cashing place. Windows boarded up, graffiti layered, so thick you couldn't tell what color the building used to be. That's where Margaret slept. Cardboard flattened beneath her. A faded green military jacket pulled tight around her shoulders. A wool blanket that had seen better decades. Everything she owned fit into 2 plastic grocery bags tied to the bench. Most people didn't look at her. Some pretended she wasn't there at all, staring at their phones, their faces carefully blank. Others crossed to the other side of the street before they even got close. Jalen had done the same thing for 2 weeks. Told himself he couldn't help. He was barely keeping himself fed, barely making tuition payments, barely surviving. But one morning in late September, he'd packed 2 granola bars for his shift, the cheap kind, 6 in a box for $3, and realized he'd only have time to eat one. His break was 10 minutes. Then back to loading trucks until 3 p.m. Then straight to campus for anatomy and physiology at 5:30. The second bar would just get crushed in his bag. Margaret was awake when he approached, sitting upright on the bench, her back straight despite everything. Her eyes were sharp, clearer than he expected. She watched him like she was used to people either pretending she was invisible or telling her to move along. "Excuse me," Jalen said, holding out the granola bar. "I'm not going to eat this. You want it?" She studied him for a long moment. Studied the bar, then his face again. "You need that more than I do," she said quietly. "Debatable," Jalen replied, "but I'm offering." She took it with both hands, carefully like it mattered. "Thank you, son." Jalen nodded. "Jalen." Margaret Dawson. She unwrapped the bar slowly, deliberately. Served in the Army. Long time ago now. He almost walked away then. Almost went back to his routine of keeping his head down, not getting involved, not letting the world's problems become his problems. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she'd said thank you, with dignity, not desperation. Maybe it was the way she sat, spine straight, like she still remembered standing at attention. "You want coffee tomorrow?" he asked. "I'll bring a thermos anyway." Her eyebrows lifted just slightly. "Black's fine." The next morning, he brought the thermos in an orange. The morning after that, another granola bar and a banana. By the end of the first week, it wasn't even a decision anymore. It was just what he did. 6:45 a.m. Every single day, Margaret was always awake, always waiting at the same bench, her belongings neatly arranged beside her. They talked for maybe 5 minutes before his bus came. She'd ask about his classes. He was trying to get into a nursing program, trying to build something that looked like a future. He'd ask how she was doing, and she'd tell him stories. Strange stories. Flew medevac in desert storm, she'd say, staring past him at something he couldn't see. Pulled men out of burning vehicles. Some of them made it. Some didn't. Or Worked logistics for a colonel who reported directly to the Pentagon. Can't say much more than that. Some things stay classified. Jalen figured maybe her memory was going. Maybe she was mixing up things she'd seen in movies with things she'd actually lived. Maybe the streets had worn down the line between real and imagined. He didn't correct her. He just listened. Not everyone was so kind. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, and for 6 weeks, Jalen Carter walked past her every single morning without really seeing her. Not because he was cruel, not because he didn't care, but because that's what everyone did. Eleanor sat on the same spot every day, a concrete ledge outside the old laundromat, the one that had closed down 3 years ago and never reopened. The windows were clouded with grime and years of neglect. The metal grate was pulled down permanently, covered in rust and overlapping tags from neighborhood kids. She'd arrive before dawn and stay until after dark, wrapped in a faded green coat that might have been expensive once, maybe decades ago. Her silver hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, even though her hands shook when she tried to smooth it down. She kept her belongings in 2 canvas bags at her feet, organized, not scattered. Everything folded, everything in its place. She looked like someone's grandmother. She looked like someone who used to host Thanksgiving dinners and remember everyone's birthday. Now, she looked like someone the city had forgotten existed. People walked past her every day. Businessmen in sharp suits, checking their phones, earbuds in, eyes forward. Mothers with strollers, gripping their children's hands a little tighter, speeding up as they passed. Teenagers laughing in groups, loud and careless, not even registering her presence. Some people crossed the street before they reached her. A small detour, barely noticeable, just enough to avoid the discomfort of walking too close to someone living on the margins. Others looked right through her, their eyes sliding past as if she were part of the architecture. A fire hydrant, a mailbox, something that existed but didn't require acknowledgement. Eleanor never called out to anyone, never asked for money, never held up a sign. She just sat there, day after day, hands folded in her lap, watching the world move around her like water flowing past a stone. If this story moves you, don't just scroll past. Share it. Some people need to know that kindness still exists. It was a Thursday morning in early October when Jalen finally saw her. He was running late, overslept by 15 minutes because his phone had died overnight and his alarm never went off. He was speed walking toward the bus stop, backpack bouncing against his shoulders, mentally calculating whether he'd make it to the warehouse on time or get written up again. That's when he saw her struggling with a thermos. Eleanor was sitting on her usual spot, the green coat pulled tight around her thin frame, despite the morning sun already warming the pavement. She held a silver thermos in both hands, old, dented, the kind with a screw-top lid and a small cup that doubled as a cap. Her hands were shaking, not a little. A lot. She'd get the lid halfway unscrewed, then her fingers would slip and she'd have to start over. Her jaw was set, her lips pressed into a thin line of determination. She wasn't giving up, but she also wasn't succeeding. Jalen slowed down. His bus would be there in 4 minutes. He should keep walking. He should mind his business. But something about the way she kept trying, the way she refused to ask for help even though she clearly needed it, made him stop. "Excuse me," he said, approaching carefully, keeping his voice gentle. "You need help with that?" Eleanor looked up, and for just a second, there was something in her eyes, a flash of shame, maybe, or embarrassment. The look of someone who used to be capable, who used to do everything herself, now confronted with the reality that her body no longer cooperated. "I can manage," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, educated. The kind of voice that had once commanded respect in rooms that mattered. "I know you can," Jalen said. He crouched down so he wasn't standing over her. "But I got a minute. Let me help." She hesitated, then handed him the thermos. He unscrewed the lid easily, poured the coffee, lukewarm, probably hours old, into the small cup, and handed both pieces back to her. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her trembling fingers around the cup like it was something precious. Jalen noticed her bags then. Canvas, not plastic. Warm but clean. Inside one, he could see the corner of a folded blanket. A book with a cracked spine. A small toiletry bag, zipped shut. Everything organized. Everything dignified. He thought about the granola bar in his backpack. The orange he'd packed for his afternoon break. "You eat yet?" he asked. Eleanor's eyes met his. There was caution there. And something else. A kind of quiet resignation, like she'd learned not to expect much from people anymore. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head. Once, barely perceptible, Jalen pulled out the granola bar and the orange. Set them on the ledge beside her, not in her hands. Not making her take them, just offering. "I packed too much," he lied. "Can't eat all that and make my shift on time." Eleanor stared at the food. Her hand was still shaking, still wrapped around the coffee cup. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "I know," Jalen replied. "But I want to." She picked up the granola bar slowly, carefully, like she was afraid it might disappear if she moved too fast. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're very kind." Jalen stood up, adjusted his backpack. His bus was pulling up to the stop, half a block away. "I'm here most mornings," he said. "Same time. If you need anything." He didn't wait for her to respond. Just jogged toward the bus, hopped on seconds before the doors closed. As the bus pulled away, he glanced back through the window. Eleanor was still sitting there, the granola bar unwrapped in her lap, her silver hair catching the morning light. She wasn't eating yet. She was just holding it, like it was the first kind thing anyone had given her in a very long time. And maybe it was. By the second week, it wasn't a decision anymore. It was just what Jalen did. Every morning at 6:45 a.m., before catching the Route 9 bus, he'd stop at the ledge outside the old laundromat with something for Eleanor Whitmore. Monday, a peanut butter sandwich and an apple. Tuesday, leftover rice and chicken in a container he didn't need back. Wednesday, a granola bar and a banana. Thursday, soup in a thermos, the cheap kind from a can, but warm. Friday, whatever he could pull together from his near-empty pantry. He never made a big deal out of it, never announced himself or waited for gratitude. He just set the food down beside her, maybe exchange a few words, then move on. But something changed in those first 2 weeks. Something Jalen didn't expect. He started staying longer. Not much, just a few extra minutes. Long enough to make sure she could open the container. Long enough to watch her take the first few bites. Long enough to know she was actually eating, not just setting it aside for later that might never come. Eleanor never asked him to stay, but she never asked him to leave either. They didn't talk much at first. The silence between them was comfortable, uncomplicated. Jalen would crouch on the curb a few feet away, scrolling through his phone or reviewing notes for class, while Eleanor ate slowly, carefully, like she was trying to make each bite last. Sometimes she'd comment on the weather. Sometimes he'd mention something from work. Mostly, they just existed in the same space. Two people the world kept trying to make invisible, choosing to see each other instead. Real change doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in small moments repeated. If this story touches you, share it. Remind someone that consistency matters. By the third week, Jalen noticed the changes. Small things. Easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Eleanor started sitting straighter. Her spine, which had been curved and defeated when he first saw her, began to straighten. Her shoulders pulled back. She held her head higher when people walked past, even if they still refused to look at her. She started brushing her hair differently. The silver bun was neater now, more deliberate. She'd smooth it with her trembling hands before Jalen arrived, like she was preparing for a meeting that mattered. And she started waiting for him. Jalen could tell, because on the mornings he arrived a few minutes early, she'd already be watching the direction he always came from. On the mornings he was running late, he'd catch her checking an old wristwatch, her expression tightening with something that looked like worry. Like maybe she thought he wouldn't come. Like maybe she thought this kindness had an expiration date. But Jalen kept coming. When October turned cold, he brought soup more often. Hot tea in a thermos with a little honey stirred in. He learned she liked it sweet. Extra napkins. A pair of knit gloves he'd found at the thrift store for $2. Eleanor took the gloves without a word, but he saw her wearing them every day after that, even when her hands were tucked inside her coat pockets. By November, they were talking more. Not about the hard stuff. Not about why she was out here, or where she'd come from, or what had gone wrong. Jalen didn't ask, and Eleanor didn't offer. Instead, she told him stories. Strange stories. "I wore a uniform once," she said one morning, staring past him at something only she could see. "Army. Long time ago now. Felt like being part of something bigger than yourself." Jalen nodded, chewing on his own breakfast. "What did you do?" "Logistics. Supply chain management." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of the thermos. "Moved things that weren't supposed to exist to places that weren't on maps." Jalen glanced at her, but her expression was distant, unreadable. "Classified stuff?" he asked. "Something like that." She smiled faintly. "Nobody believes me when I tell them. They think I'm confused. Making things up. I'm not saying I don't believe you," Jalen said carefully. "But you're not saying you do either." There was no bitterness in her voice, just acceptance. He shrugged. "I don't know enough about the Army to say either way, but sounds cool." Eleanor looked at him, then really looked at him, and something softened in her face. "You're a good boy, Jalen. Your mama raised you right." He didn't tell her that his mama had been gone since he was 12, that he'd mostly raised himself in a series of foster homes that barely counted as homes at all. He just said, "Thank you, ma'am." Another morning, she mentioned a base in Germany. "Ever heard of Rammstein?" she asked, blowing on her tea. "The band." She laughed. The first time he'd heard her laugh. It was soft, rusty, like something that hadn't been used in years. "The air base. I was stationed there for 3 years. Coordinated munitions transfers across Europe. Worked with NATO, DoD contractors, people whose names I never learned and wasn't supposed to remember." Jalen listened, nodding along, mentally filing it away as another story he couldn't verify but wouldn't dismiss. Maybe she had done those things. Maybe her memory was mixing up truth with imagination. Maybe it didn't matter, because what mattered was this. Every morning, Eleanor Whitmore sat a little straighter, smiled a little more, ate a little slower, like she wasn't just trying to survive anymore, like she remembered what it felt like to be human. And every morning, Jalen Carter showed up, not because he wanted credit, not because he expected anything in return, but because once you start seeing someone, really seeing them, it's impossible to look away. By the time December arrived, their routine was unshakable. Jalen brought breakfast. Eleanor waited for him. They shared a few minutes of quiet conversation. Then he'd catch his bus, and she'd settle back into her spot, no longer invisible. At least not to him. And for a little while, in a city that had forgotten both of them, that was enough. It was a Tuesday morning in mid-December when Jalen's world tilted sideways. 6:45 a.m. Same time as always. Same route as always. Backpack over one shoulder, thermos of hot tea in hand, a turkey sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil tucked inside a paper bag. He rounded the corner toward the old laundromat, breath fogging in the frozen air, already rehearsing the greeting he'd give Eleanor. Something about the cold snap, maybe, or asking if she needed an extra blanket. But when he reached the ledge, his steps faltered. She wasn't there. The concrete where she always sat was bare. No canvas bags, no folded blanket, no faded green coat. Even the flattened cardboard she used as a cushion, the piece she kept tucked behind the dumpster and pulled out every morning, was gone. Jalen stopped walking. His heart kicked once hard against his ribs. He scanned the block. Maybe she'd moved to a different spot. Maybe she was in the alley behind the building, out of the wind. Nothing. The bus shelter across the street was empty except for a woman in scrubs scrolling through her phone. The sidewalk was deserted. Eleanor Whitmore had vanished. Jalen stood there longer than he should have. Long enough that the Route 9 bus came and went without him. Long enough that his hands started going numb even inside his gloves. He told himself she'd probably found somewhere warmer to sleep. A shelter, maybe, or someone had finally helped her. A social worker, a church group, somebody. But the knot in his stomach didn't loosen, because Eleanor had been there every single morning for 3 months. Rain, cold, wind, it didn't matter. She was always on that ledge, waiting. She wouldn't just leave, not without saying something. Sometimes the absence of someone hits harder than their presence ever did. If this story grips you, share it, because caring about people shouldn't stop when they disappear. Jalen caught the next bus, 20 minutes late for his shift. His supervisor gave him a warning. Jalen barely heard it. All through his morning, loading pallets, scanning boxes, stacking inventory, his mind kept circling back to that empty ledge. At lunch, he walked back. Still nothing. After his shift ended at 3 p.m., he went back again. The ledge was still empty. The winter sun was already sinking low, casting long shadows across the closed storefronts. Jalen approached a man sweeping the sidewalk outside the corner store 2 doors down. "Excuse me," Jalen said. There was a woman who used to sit over there. Older lady, silver hair, green coat. "You seen her?" The man didn't look up. "No, she was here every day. You had to have noticed." "I don't notice nothing," the man said flatly. "That's how I stay out of trouble." Jalen tried 3 more people. A delivery driver, a woman walking her dog, a teenager waiting for the bus. Nobody had seen anything. Nobody remembered her. It was like Eleanor Whitmore had never existed at all. On Wednesday, Jalen went to the police. The precinct was 10 blocks away, a squat brick building with fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. He waited 40 minutes before an officer called him to the desk. "I want to file a missing persons report," Jalen said. The officer, a white guy in his 40s with tired eyes, pulled out a form. "Name? Eleanor Whitmore. Your relationship to her?" Jalen hesitated. I'm a friend." "Age?" "I don't know. 60s maybe." "Last known address?" She didn't have one. She was homeless. The officer's pen stopped moving. He looked up at Jalen with an expression that was half sympathy, half exhaustion. "Son, we get dozens of people moving through the streets every week. Unless there's evidence of foul play." "She wouldn't just disappear," Jalen interrupted. "She was there every single morning for months." "Something's wrong." The officer sighed. "Let me check the system." He typed slowly, squinting at the screen. Then his expression changed. His eyebrows pulled together. He leaned closer to the monitor. He muttered. "What?" "Says here in Eleanor Whitmore, female, approximately 65 years old, was brought into Mercy General Hospital yesterday morning. Collapsed on the street. Exposure and malnutrition." Relief flooded through Jalen so fast it made him dizzy. "Is she okay?" The officer was still staring at the screen, his frown deepening. "That's strange." "What?" "Her records are flagged. Restricted access." He clicked something, then leaned back. "I can't pull up any details. It's routed through some kind of federal database." "Federal?" Jalen's stomach tightened again. "What does that mean?" "I don't know." The officer looked genuinely confused. "Usually that means witness protection or active military. But for a homeless woman..." He shook his head. "That doesn't make sense. Can I visit her?" "You could try. Mercy General, 4th floor. But if her records are sealed, they might not let you in." Jalen went straight to the hospital. Mercy General was a sprawling complex on the east side, all white walls and sanitized air. He found the information desk, explained he was there to see Eleanor Whitmore. The receptionist typed, frowned, typed again. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't have anyone by that name registered." The police said she was admitted yesterday. 4th floor. "Let me check with the supervisor." 5 minutes later, a nurse appeared, a black woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and no-nonsense energy. "You're asking about Eleanor Whitmore?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm a friend. I just want to know if she's okay." The nurse studied him for a long moment. "Her chart's locked. I can't access her records without authorization." "Authorization from who?" "I don't know. It just says restricted and gives me a phone number to call if anyone asks about her." She paused. "That phone number has a Virginia area code. Pentagon prefix." Jalen felt something cold slide down his spine. "The Pentagon?" The nurse's expression softened slightly. "Look, all I can tell you is she's stable. But someone's paying very close attention to who knows she's here. Can I see her?" "Not without clearance." Jalen stood there, his mind racing. Eleanor's stories, the uniform, the bases, the places not on maps. Nobody believes me when I tell them. "What the hell was she?" Jalen whispered. The nurse didn't answer, but her silence said everything. Jalen went back to the hospital the next morning, and the morning after that. Each time, the answer was the same: restricted access, no visitors allowed. Call this number if you have questions. He never called the number. Something told him that asking questions would only make things more complicated. But on Friday morning, 3 days after Eleanor disappeared, everything changed. Jalen arrived at Mercy General at 6:30 a.m. before his shift, carrying a small bouquet of flowers he'd bought from the bodega for $5. He knew they wouldn't let him deliver them. He knew he probably wouldn't even get past the information desk. But he needed to try. He needed Eleanor to know someone was still looking for her. That's when he saw them. For people in military dress uniforms walking through the main entrance with the kind of purpose that made everyone else instinctively move out of their way. 3 men, 1 woman, Navy, Army, Air Force, and 1 uniform Jalen didn't recognize, dark, understated, with insignia that looked intentionally vague. A hospital administrator met them in the lobby, shaking hands, speaking in low, urgent tones. Then the group disappeared into an elevator marked staff only. Jalen's pulse quickened. He approached the information desk. Different receptionist this time, a young guy, early 20s, who looked bored out of his mind. "Those military people," Jalen said casually. "They here for someone important?" The guy shrugged. "Probably. We get VA cases sometimes. They go up to 4. I don't know, man. I just check people in." Jalen waited. He sat in the lobby for 2 hours, flowers wilting in his lap, watching the elevators. At 8:47 a.m., the same group emerged, -1. The officer in the dark uniform was gone. The others walked out without speaking, their faces unreadable. Jalen's phone buzzed. A text from his supervisor. "Where are you?" He ignored it. At 10:15 a.m., the nurse from before, the one who'd told him about the Pentagon prefix, came downstairs for a coffee break. Jalen intercepted her near the vending machines. "Please," he said, "I just need to know what's going on. Is Eleanor okay?" The nurse looked around, then lowered her voice. "You didn't hear this from me. I won't say anything." She hesitated, then sighed. "They unsealed her records this morning. Only for about an hour, but I saw some of it before they locked them again." And Eleanor Whitmore wasn't just Army. She was Defense Intelligence Agency. Worked Cold War-era signals intelligence, classified operations in East Berlin, Prague, Moscow. She analyzed intercepted communications from Soviet military networks. Jalen stared at her. She was a spy? Analyst. But yeah, basically. The nurse glanced over her shoulder again. The program she worked for was called Operation STRSHADOW. It was so classified that when it shut down in 1992, they erased it completely, destroyed records, reassigned personnel, buried everything. Why? I don't know. Political reasons, probably. Plausible deniability. The kind of thing governments do when they don't want to admit what they were involved in. Jalen's mind was racing. So, what happened to her? If she worked for them, where's her pension? Her benefits? The nurse's expression darkened. That's the thing. When they erased the program, they erased the people too. Everyone who worked on Star Shadow got reassigned to fake positions, desk jobs, clerical work, roles that didn't actually involve intelligence. On paper, Eleanor Whitmore spent 30 years filing paperwork in a logistics office. No commendations, no security clearance, no record of what she actually did. That's insane. That's classified. The nurse shook her head. When she retired in 2003, her pension was based on that fake position. Barely enough to survive. And because her real service didn't officially exist, she couldn't appeal. Couldn't fight it. She just fell through the cracks. Systems fail. Institutions forget. But people don't have to. If this story breaks your heart, share it, because the people society abandons still deserve to be remembered. Jalen felt something hot and sharp building in his chest. So, she ended up on the street because the government buried her? Essentially, yes. The nurse's voice was quiet. She lost her apartment in 2019. Couldn't afford rent on that pension. Applied for assistance. But without documentation of her real service, she didn't qualify for veteran housing. No family to take her in. No safety net. She sacrificed everything for them, Jalen whispered. And they just forgot about her. They didn't forget. The nurse met his eyes. They chose not to remember. There's a difference. Jalen stayed in the hospital lobby until visiting hours ended. He didn't try to go upstairs again. He just sat there, holding those $5 flowers, thinking about Eleanor Whitmore. About a woman who'd spent decades protecting her country in ways no one would ever know. About how she'd been erased twice, once by her government, and again by every person who walked past her on that sidewalk without looking. About how the most powerful military in the world had abandoned her to die alone on a concrete ledge. And about how the only person who'd noticed was an 18-year-old kid working a warehouse job, who'd shared his breakfast because he couldn't stand to see her hungry. The irony was suffocating. A system with billion-dollar budgets, endless resources, and entire departments dedicated to supporting our troops had discarded her like trash. But one teenager with nothing had remembered her every single day. The flowers were completely wilted now, petals browning at the edges. Jalen set them on the reception desk before he left. For Eleanor Whitmore, he told the receptionist. 4th floor. Make sure she gets them. The receptionist nodded, not looking up from his screen. Jalen walked out into the cold December afternoon, his chest tight, his mind spinning. He didn't know if Eleanor would ever see those flowers. He didn't know if she'd even remember him. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The system that had buried her didn't deserve her service. And the country that had forgotten her didn't deserve her sacrifice. But maybe, just maybe, she deserved to know that someone had seen her. Not as a statistic, not as a problem to be managed, but as a human being, someone who mattered. Even if the only person who believed that was a kid from the warehouse who brought her breakfast every morning at 6:45 a.m. The knock came at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning. Jalen was already awake. He was always awake by 6, body clock trained by months of early shifts and pre-dawn routines. He was in the kitchen of his small apartment, pouring water into the cheap coffee maker he'd bought at a yard sale when he heard it. 3 firm knocks. Measured. Deliberate. The kind of knock that didn't ask for permission. It announced arrival. Jalen froze, coffee grounds spilling across the counter. Nobody knocked on his door at 6 in the morning. Nobody knocked on his door at all. He crossed the tiny living room, 10 steps from kitchen to door, and looked through the peephole. His stomach dropped. For people stood in the dim hallway, all wearing military dress uniforms. Full regalia, medals catching the fluorescent light from the stairwell. Polished shoes, straight spines. The kind of presence that made the cramped, water-stained hallway look even smaller by comparison. Jalen's hands went cold. What did I do? Another knock. Firmer this time. Jalen Carter? A voice, deep and formal, carried through the door. We need to speak with you. Jalen's mind raced. Eleanor. This had to be about Eleanor. Had he broken some law by asking about her? Had he triggered something by showing up at the hospital? Maybe her records were so classified that even asking questions was a crime. Maybe they thought he was trying to expose something. Maybe they thought he was a threat. His hand hesitated on the deadbolt. Jalen Carter, the voice repeated. Please open the door. It wasn't a request. Jalen unlocked the deadbolt, then the chain, then pulled the door open. 4 officers stood at attention in the hallway. A colonel, Army, based on the insignia. Silver hair, jaw like carved stone, rows of ribbons across his chest. A Navy captain, younger, black, with sharp eyes that took in everything in a single glance. An Air Force lieutenant colonel, a woman with red hair pulled back in a tight bun. And a brigadier general, 1 star on each shoulder, wearing the dark uniform Jalen had seen in the hospital. The general stood at the front. When Jalen opened the door, the general snapped to attention, back straight, chin up, heels together. The others followed. 4 decorated military officers standing at attention in the hallway of a Section 8 apartment building where the heat barely worked and the walls were covered in peeling paint. Sometimes courage doesn't wear a uniform. Sometimes it looks like an 18-year-old kid who just did the right thing. If this moment hits you, share it. The world needs to see what real honor looks like. Jalen's throat went dry. Jalen Carter, the general asked, though his tone made it clear he already knew the answer. Yes, sir. Jalen's voice came out smaller than he intended. I'm Brigadier General Marcus Hale, Defense Intelligence Agency. These are Colonel Reeves, Captain Washington, and Lieutenant Colonel Stevens. He paused, his expression unreadable. We're here because of what you did for Eleanor Whitmore. Jalen's heart hammered against his ribs. Here it comes. The consequences. The punishment for asking too many questions. I didn't mean to cause any trouble, Jalen said quickly. I was just trying to make sure she was okay. I didn't know about any of the classified stuff. I swear, I wasn't trying to. Son, General Hale interrupted gently. You're not in trouble. Jalen blinked. I'm not. No. The general's expression softened, just slightly. May we come in? Jalen glanced back at his apartment. The sagging futon that doubled as his bed. The card table he used for eating and studying. The stack of textbooks on the floor. The kitchen with exactly 3 dishes in the sink. It's not really, it's kind of a mess. We don't mind, Captain Washington said. His voice was warm, human, cutting through the formality. Jalen stepped aside. The 4 officers entered, moving carefully in the cramped space, their uniforms too pristine for the surroundings. They didn't sit. They just stood there, filling the tiny living room with a presence that felt too large, too important for a place like this. General Hale turned to face Jalen directly. What you did for Eleanor Whitmore, he began, took more courage than most people will ever understand. Jalen shook his head, confused. I brought her breakfast. That's all. That's not all, Colonel Reeves said. You saw her. Every day, when everyone else walked past, you stopped. For 3 months, Lieutenant Colonel Stevens added. In the cold, before work, without recognition or reward. Jalen's mind was spinning. I don't understand. Why are you here? General Hale reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Eleanor Whitmore regained consciousness 2 days ago, he said. She's still weak, but she's coherent. And the first thing she asked about, the only thing she asked about was you. Jalen's chest tightened. Is she okay? She's recovering, but that's not why we're here. The general unfolded the paper. Mrs. Whitmore spent 32 years serving this country in ways we can't discuss. She did things that kept people safe, prevented conflicts, saved lives. And when her program ended, the system failed her. Completely. Jalen said nothing. We're here, General Hale continued, his voice steady but heavy with something that might have been shame, because you did what we should have done. You honored her service by treating her with dignity when no one else would. I didn't know about her service, Jalen whispered. Exactly. Captain Washington stepped forward. You didn't help her because she was a veteran. You helped her because she was a human being. That matters. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens nodded. The military talks a lot about honor, loyalty, service. But you lived it without ever wearing a uniform. The room fell silent. Jalen stood there, hands trembling slightly, trying to process what was happening. Sir, he finally said, looking at General Hale, I still don't understand why you're here. The general's expression shifted, something between respect and regret. Because Eleanor Whitmore wants to meet the young man who refused to let her be invisible. And because we need to make this right. He held out the folded paper. This is a formal invitation to Mercy General Hospital. Today, Eleanor is waiting for you. Jalen took the paper with shaking hands. And after that, General Hale added quietly, we need to talk about what happens next. For her, and for you. Eleanor Whitmore died on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Jalen first visited her hospital room. She passed quietly, peacefully, in a clean bed with warm blankets and sunlight streaming through the window, a dignity she hadn't known in years. Jalen was at work when he got the call. General Hale himself delivered the news, his voice steady but weighted with something deeper than professional courtesy. She asked me to tell you something, the general said. She wanted you to know that you gave her back something she thought was gone forever. What? Jalen's voice cracked. The feeling of being seen. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday morning in late December. Arlington National Cemetery. Jalen stood at the edge of the gathering, wearing the only dress clothes he owned, black pants from Goodwill, a white button-down shirt he'd ironed twice, and his gray hoodie underneath because it was freezing and he didn't own a coat nice enough for this. He fell out of place. Everyone else wore uniforms or expensive suits. Generals, colonels, officials from agencies Jalen had never heard of. People who moved with authority, who belonged in spaces like this. Jalen was just a kid from a warehouse who'd shared his breakfast. But General Hale had insisted he come. "You're not a guest," the general had told him on the phone. "You're the reason we're here." The ceremony began with military precision. An honor guard, 6 soldiers in dress blues, moving in perfect synchronization. The flag-draped casket positioned over the grave. A chaplain speaking words about service and sacrifice. But it was what came next that broke something open in Jalen's chest. General Hale stepped forward, holding a single piece of paper. "Before Eleanor Whitmore passed," he said, his voice carrying across the silent cemetery, "she wrote a letter. She asked that it be read here, today, in front of everyone gathered." He unfolded the paper carefully. She titled it, "To the Boy Who Remembered." Jalen's breath caught. General Hale began to read. "My name is Eleanor Ruth Whitmore. I served my country for 32 years in silence. I intercepted enemy communications. I analyzed threats. I helped prevent conflicts most people will never know existed. When my service ended, my country forgot I existed. No pension that reflected my work. No recognition. No honor. Just paperwork that erased everything I'd done and left me with barely enough to survive. I didn't become homeless because I was weak. I became homeless because the system I devoted my life to decided I didn't matter anymore. I sat on that sidewalk for 2 years. Thousands of people walked past me. Some pretended I wasn't there. Some looked through me like I was invisible. Some stepped over me like I was debris. Then one morning, a boy stopped. He didn't know who I was. Didn't know what I'd done. Didn't know my name. He just saw a hungry woman and decided that mattered. Jalen Carter brought me breakfast every single morning for 3 months. He stayed to make sure I ate. He asked how I was doing. He listened when I told stories no one else believed. He treated me like a human being when the world had decided I was disposable. That boy, 18 years old, working 2 jobs, barely surviving himself, gave me something the United States military never did. Dignity. I'm writing this because I want everyone to know the greatest act of service I ever witnessed didn't come from a soldier. It came from a teenager in a gray hoodie who shared his lunch. Jalen didn't save my life. He did something harder. He made me remember I was worth saving. General Hale folded the letter. The cemetery was silent except for the wind moving through the trees. Jalen stood frozen, tears streaming down his face, hands shoved deep in his hoodie pockets. This is what real heroism looks like. Not medals or uniforms, but showing up when no one else will. Share this story. Remind the world that kindness is the truest form of courage. After the letter, things moved quickly. The honor guard fired a 3-volley salute. A bugler played taps, the notes rising and fading into the cold air. The flag was folded with ritualistic precision and presented to a distant cousin of Eleanor's, a woman in her 40s who admitted she hadn't spoken to Eleanor in 15 years and looked uncomfortable holding the triangle of fabric. General Hale approached Jalen after the ceremony. The Department of Defense is launching a full investigation into Operation SDRSHADOW, he said quietly. Eleanor's files have been unsealed. Her service record is being corrected, and we're reviewing every other case from that program to make sure this never happens again. Jalen nodded, barely processing the words. There's something else. The general handed him an envelope. Eleanor left instructions. She had a life insurance policy, small, but it's yours. She wanted you to finish school. Said you reminded her why she served in the first place. Jalen stared at the envelope, hands trembling. I don't deserve this. She thought you did. And frankly, son, after what I've seen, I agree. 1 week later, a different ceremony took place. Not at Arlington. At the bus shelter outside the old laundromat. The same cracked sidewalk. The same concrete ledge. The same place Eleanor had sat invisible for 2 years. General Hale stood there with a small delegation, 4 officers, 2 city officials, and Jalen. They unveiled a plaque, bolted permanently to the wall. In memory of Eleanor Ruth Whitmore, intelligence analyst, U.S. Army 1957 to 2024, her service was classified. Her sacrifice was real. One person remembered. Beneath it, a bench. New, solid, with a small inscription. For those the world forgets. The officers saluted. The city officials gave speeches about compassion and community. And Jalen just stood there in his gray hoodie, hands in his pockets, staring at the spot where Eleanor used to sit. People walked past on their way to work. Most didn't notice the ceremony. A few glanced over, curious, then kept walking. But one woman, middle-aged, wearing scrubs, probably heading to a shift at the hospital, stopped. She read the plaque. Then she sat down on the bench, pulled out her phone, and started scrolling. Just existing. Just taking up space. And for the first time since Eleanor died, Jalen smiled. Because that bench would be there tomorrow. And the day after that. And someone who needed it would find it. Someone the world had decided didn't matter. And maybe, just maybe, someone else would stop. Someone else would see them. Someone else would remember that kindness doesn't require a uniform or a rank or a reason. It just requires showing up. Eleanor Whitmore's legacy wasn't the intelligence she gathered or the threats she neutralized. It was this, proof that one act of consistent, quiet, unwitnessed kindness could resurrect a life the system tried to bury. And that mattered more than any medal ever could. Eleanor's legacy wasn't her service. It was one boy who refused to look away. Share this story. Be that person for someone else.